Hi Dr. Carpenter and my group members. Today I'm going to walk you through the conflict happening in Western Sahara, which is located in northwest Africa. And in 1973, there was a rebel insurgency group known as the Polisario Front against the then Spanish colonial powers. The ICJ recognized the right of the people of Western Sahara, or the Sahrawi people, to self-determination. However, in 1975, the Kingdom of Morocco claimed that territory as part of its own boundaries, and there's been conflict ever since between the Moroccan government and the Polisario Front. In 1991, the UN brokered a ceasefire and established a peacekeeping force known as MINURSO that has maintained the ceasefire ever since. However, the conflict is at a relative stalemate for now. So now that we see on the map what the conflict is about, let's go check out another map to understand the conflict. So, as Rosigliano says, we can break this down into structural, attitudinal, and transactional factors. So if we start up here by the structural, a big structural factor would be the land dispute. We saw on the map where the actual physical territory of the Western Sahara lies. Another structural factor, given the occupation, is a displaced population. And then on an economic level, there's severe employment, which we can get into later. Some key attitudinal factors that are occurring as a result of the displaced populations and the marginalization. We have several emotional wounds, particularly around that event in 1975 when the Moroccan kingdom claimed the territory. You have marginalization of the populations today, whether the ones in refugee camps or in occupied territories, and you also have a very rigid group identity. On the transactional side, you have corruption in the military, because it's one of the largest sources of employment for Moroccans is the sheer numbers of military personnel that are employed in the Western Sahara territory. You have the presence of a negotiation process that has been ongoing since the 90s, with several UN envoys helping that to move forward. And then you have some peaceful protests, but as we'll see, those get repressed. And we have some linked factors as well. You have, going back to the presence of the negotiation process, that's due directly to international interference, which is both a transactional and a structural factor. Because of the Moroccan government's policy, you have some serious lack of voice and expressive freedoms for the Sahrawi people, which is both structural and attitudinal. And then if you look in the occupied territories themselves, you have some serious tensions between the settler population and the Sahrawi community, which is transactional and attitudinal as well. And the one factor that is kind of a mix between structural, attitudinal, and transactional is this ongoing, what I call the bolstering of Moroccan territorial integrity. That's the Moroccan government's monopoly on the image of Morocco that they want in a very physical and political way, as well as cultural. So when I was looking at these factors, I thought that land disputes would probably be the place to start with my map, but then I realized that really this factor of bolstering Moroccan territorial integrity has a bigger impact and is impacted by other factors as well, so I thought that was probably a more appropriate place to go. Which brings me to our concept map. So this is by no means an exhaustive map, it's just showing a few trends that I chose to highlight. So if we start with this bolstering of Moroccan territorial integrity, which is historical and ongoing, this can lead to the marginalization and exploitation of Sahrawi populations. The more the Moroccan-only identity is asserted, the more marginalization occurs, so that's a plus. Quite obviously, the level of marginalization and exploitation creates some serious community hardships, and it increases the level of grievances. That's a plus plus. And over time, which is what the question mark here is, over time the level of grievances contribute to what I've kind of collected in this bubble over here, a very rigid group identity of what it means to be Sahrawi, which entails a perception of victimization and a very deep tradition of resistance and struggle, first against the Spanish colonial power and now against the Moroccan colonial power. And this, in turn, this group identity lends itself to community resilience and what I've called agitation. And this can be in protests or in, at one point it was armed non-state forces, but with the ceasefire that's kind of changed a little bit. However, the more resilience and agitation that is expressed or struggled to be expressed by the Sahrawi population, the more the Moroccan government represses these movements. And the more that they're repressed, the more agitation as well occurs. So this is sort of a loop here as well. But ultimately the repression leads to an even stronger assertion of that Moroccan territorial integrity. So this whole loop here is quite reinforcing. Another factor created out of this bolstering of the Moroccan territorial image is occupation in the very real sense. So we started with the marginalization and exploitation in kind of the more attitudinal plane, and the occupation being a very physical, structural factor. And there's a couple things that happen out of occupation. You have another structural factor of displaced people, which directly relates to land disputes, because if you have people that are displaced expecting to go back to their homeland, then there's a link there. And because this land dispute also has some serious implications for other world economies, as in the United States and France and Great Britain and other trading partners. There's implications for Morocco's neighbors, Mauritania and Algeria. You have a lot of international interference, so that's fed into here. And the more the international world pushes on Morocco, again, the more they want to bolster that territorial integrity. Also, occupation is a very expensive strategy that the Moroccan government is using. They have to spend a lot of money to give stipends to Moroccans that they have pretty much incentivized to go in and live in the Western Sahara territories. So it's a very expensive operation. And so the more occupation you have, the worse off the economy is going to be. And in these occupied territories, not to mention the refugee camps, having a poor economy or poor job prospects leads to some serious settler-Sahrawi tensions, even more so than just the identity, but very closely linked. And then, of course, the tensions between the two communities causes them both to kind of claim their stake in the land, which, again, we already noticed was an international affair, and it leads back to the Moroccan territorial integrity. So one thing I'm hoping to explore in my paper in terms of identifying what a transactional catalyst would be is in this attitudinal plane, thinking about the Sahrawi population and where they are spatially. You have refugees, you have those living in the occupied cities, and you also have the diaspora of Sahrawi people worldwide. But possibly one interesting thing to look at would be a new role for the women in these communities as having to fill a void, or having their role changed in the society as providers and breadwinners, but now with this very deep sense of self-sufficiency paired with this perception of victimization, you see a very interesting opportunity for women to begin taking a different approach. And in fact, a growing percentage of the protesters are Sahrawi women today. So that's my concept map. I look forward to seeing you next week.